Kia ora koutou ko John Reid toku ingoa. Welcome to this edition of Water New Zealand's podcast series, Tāwara o Tuai. I'm John Reid from Water New Zealand.
Pretty much hell come to town that weekend of February, that day in February.
Now, a few months ago, we had a podcast about Cyclone Gabrielle, and we talked with Craig Thew and Darren de Klerk, both at Hastings District Council. So I'm pleased today that we're going to talk about the impact of the 2023 Auckland anniversary floods and some of the lessons that we learned from that. To discuss this, we're joined by Fiona Macdonald, who is Manager Flood Risk at Auckland Council, and Tom Nikkel, who is a Technical Director of Stormwater Modelling at WSP, and he's been working as part of Auckland Council's flood recovery team for the last 2 years. And of course, as usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Hannah Edmund. Kia ora, Fiona, Thomas and Hannah.
Kia ora, John.
Kia ora, John.
Thanks for joining us today. Before we start, it's probably worth saying that Fiona and Tom will be speaking from their experience and what they learned. Many people were affected by this flood event, and Fiona and Tom's experience may not reflect the range of impacts that occurred. Saying that, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the recovery and some ideas about how we can be more resilient in the future. So Hannah, over to you.
Thanks, John, and welcome, Fiona and Tom. It's really great to have you here. I'm sure we haven't forgotten. It was very much at front of mind in 2023 of what happened and over the last few years. But can you maybe give us a quick reminder about what happened during the Auckland anniversary floods?
Yeah, sure. So it was actually a series of events. The first event was on Auckland anniversary weekend on the Friday, the 27th of January. That was followed a couple of weeks later by Cyclone Gabrielle. And then we actually had 3 other extreme events in the first half of 2023. The Auckland anniversary event was the most significant in many ways just because it was so widespread. An extreme event affected most of the region. We had about 1 million people that live underneath the area of the most extreme rainfall. And we estimate that in that event that around 12,000 habitable floors were flooded. So subsequent events were also significant, but they were more localised. So I think why that anniversary event was so significant was just the scope. It was a region-wide event.
And I guess just as part of that reminder for all of us of the fact that it happened then. There were obviously other floods around the country at that point in time. And what we're really focusing on here is the lessons that you guys, or the experiences you guys have had throughout that particular event and the response to those incidences.
That's also worth just mentioning, I think you touched on it briefly, Fiona, that there's that kind of degrees of experience of everyone, and there's some people that are directly affected, were in the floods or escaped during the floods, but it's also in a way like the whole city experienced the floods, and they have friends and family that were exposed as well. It was really widespread in its impacts or how it affected people's lives.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And I mean, we've heard probably thousands of stories, haven't we, Tom? And the impact of the flooding, people tend to think about the event itself, and that's massive. But what we've heard is that the impacts and the trauma continue beyond just that night, whether it's people who've told us stories of like their kid can't sleep at night anymore if it's raining because they're so scared it will happen again, or whether it's long-term health impacts, or whether it's people having difficulty getting insurance. So I think the ramifications of the event, and this is not just in Auckland but across the rest of the country who was impacted, that we're still seeing them.
It's interesting, isn't it? So often when we think about flooding from an engineering perspective, we're thinking about flood protection and how can we make communities safer and those sort of more engineering elements, but actually the fundamental impacts on people and communities go well beyond that.
Most of us are experts in that sort of technical side of flooding, and that's something that we're quite used to seeing and working with. And then suddenly we're out on site and we're interacting with and talking to people that have been through this very real, very traumatic experience. And the amount of stories that you hear around the near misses are truly like really sobering, and simple things like people just being curious and trying to go and have a look at what's happening in the flooding, and they'll go and stand on a fence and look over the fence. And when they're looking over the fence, they're kind of just climbing up the one side and looking over, and they can see the floodwaters on the other side of the fence are 500 mils higher than they are on their side of the fence. And so they get down, they go back towards their house, and then suddenly the whole fence collapses behind them, and there's a big torrent of water going past that ends up flooding their house. But you can't help in the back of your mind but think about these what ifs. And there's honestly there's so many what if stories as part of this as well. So
as engineers, it's very easy to sit in your office or in your design team meeting and talk about the practicalities of engineering, but actually all of the things that we're designing, and especially in this flooding space, are actually have very human impacts at the other end of it, and the consequences are very emotive like that, and they're those near misses. So it's a really important part of what we need to recognize when we're doing those things. I guess I'm quite interested because, again, in that context of kind of the technical and the human side of it is always so much more complex to do any analysis on, and to kind of start to understand in a way that that is tangible and you can try and pull into lessons learned into the future. But maybe, Fiona, could you share, in terms of that immediate response, what you set up to try and assess those impacts and try and help to prioritize where the responses were going? Because I'm imagining it's a lot more complex than just this place is flooded and this place wasn't. There's a lot more nuance, especially around those human factors.
Yes, that's right. So I suppose the response was divided into two phases. Initially, on the day of the event, we obviously mobilised immediately after, and it was really around trying to understand what were the impacts, what areas of Auckland were affected. And so that was all about getting people into the field to take photos, to take videos. We mobilised our wonderful consultant family to get out and do that. What else do? We also got like social media, traditional media capture through scraping. And we also set up a specific portal where Aucklanders could submit their stories and their photos and their videos of flooding. So this was all in the few months after the event, when we didn't really have the funding or mandate to go much further than just understand what happened. But then after that, I suppose I think it was middle of 2023, we had the central government mandate to intervene, the co-funding with the various councils around New Zealand, to state that there will be funding to reduce risk in situations where there was an intolerable risk to life. So while we had responded as council previous to that in terms of under our usual BAU, like the operational responses, etc., this was going a step further to understand where was most impacted, saw that intolerable risk to life, and where we could either reduce risk or go through to buyout of some of those properties. So that was really something that's quite not brand new, but relatively new in a New Zealand context. And there was quite a lot of work we did after we had that mandate to set up a framework for that decision making, how we understood what happened and where there was an intolerable risk to life, to allow us to then act to either purchase or do a property level intervention or a community level solution at those locations. And that was where our assessment team, of which Tom was one, we had about a team of 90 who were going out and understanding what the impact was at affected properties that registered for the scheme.
And I guess in that framework, it's something that is really quite time intensive to set up the first time you're doing it and trying to work it out. But is this something that Auckland Council you now have as kind of an initial framework should any event occur in the future, or when any event occurs in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we were responding in a given set of circumstances where we had the mandate from central and government and from Auckland as to invest in that risk reduction, and who knows if that will happen again with the next event. But yes, the framework, it did take a while to set up, and we were under obviously a lot of pressure to act, from the community, from politicians, to just act, get on with buying properties. But we took the time to develop that decision framework because we knew we had to make robust, consistent decisions across thousands of properties that will be challenged in the future. So it was worthwhile spending that time. And as you say, we now have that in place. Some of the concepts behind the framework in terms of how you look at risk at different locations around a property, how you integrate behavioural considerations, all that I think can be taken and applied elsewhere when we're making decisions about where there is risk to life from flooding across Auckland and the country.
How was it actually applied in practice? How did it go? Did you have to revise that at all, or did you improve it over time?
We did. It was very much building the plane as we fly it, we often say. So yes, we had an initial version. We, I guess, started with some of the clear-cut decisions in terms of Category 3 or buyout properties and Category 1 properties, so not intolerable risk to life. And then we kind of further refined the framework around some of those edge cases around did it or did it not exceed that threshold. And we worked closely with our assessment team as they applied it. So Tom might have something to say about how we refined it over time and applied it.
It was a very different experience very early on, where there was still some uncertainty, as Fiona said, building the plane still. And so obviously you're trying to react as fast as you can. So you're out there collecting information, and part of that collecting information was talking to homeowners. And so before the framework was in place, you're getting these really emotive stories, and there's so many different drivers behind people's decisions and even people's perceptions of risk, like that, different. You're talking to people with nearly identical properties with a very different perception of what happened and what's safe, and wanting to stay or desperately wanting to leave their property. It's that kind of burden, that emotional load that sort of builds up as an assessor. And you obviously, you're human, and you really want to help people, and you really want everyone, I guess, that's been through this horrible traumatic experience to have, an outcome that they want, because that's just a human nature, I guess. But when you start really getting into the details of the different circumstances and the different justifications and what's fair between different types of properties and the types of, and who's going to be living in there in the future, which might not be the person that was in there at the time, they might feel that that was an acceptable level of risk. So it just really brings home how important it is to have a consistent framework, because there's so many moving parts to the equation, I guess. And I think it's also really important for the assessors to have that, as well as having the framework itself to kind of, I guess, take some of that burden of decision making away. It's also important for the assessors to have some background on the logic behind it, and that kind of knowledge that you're working in a really evidence-based environment is really important as well, because obviously that you're doing the best you can with the best information you have available.
I think to add to that, if I can, just to give the context of the framework was about identifying where there was intolerable risk to life from flooding, and so it was a really high bar. There were a lot of people really impacted who did not exceed that threshold, but it doesn't mean they weren't heavily impacted, really traumatised. But because we had limited funding, we could only help so many people. And I think that was really tough for a lot of us involved in the process, that we had to draw a line.
So just sort of taking that further, you're in this environment where you're using these frameworks, you've got your engineering background, but you're dealing with all these sort of human or social impacts. What was the what was the impact, Fiona, on people in your teams of having to carry out these assessments? How did that work? And maybe Tom can contribute to that as well from his own personal experience.
I suppose I see my recovery team is not just the Auckland Council staff. It was a huge family of consultants, and these were drawn from about 26 different organisations. And really everyone took off their organisational hat when they walked in and were part of the recovery team. That made it a lot easier because everyone was bringing stories and difficult experiences, but we shared those collectively. We had a weekly meeting where we could be really open about the stories, the challenges, etc. And so that was incredibly helpful. Having said that, I was not someone who was having a lot of interaction with customers, so I will hand over to Tom, who probably had one of the hardest jobs along with the rest of our assessment team.
I was going to say that I think just to acknowledge that it's obviously not just my experience. There's a lot of assessors that were involved, and some of them went to quite a few more properties than me, and in different types of circumstances. And each of the stories, it really shines a light on, as well as the different people's experiences. It's also the different assessors have the degrees of experience within that as well. You really do want to help people, and it's just not something, I guess, that is part of our normal toolkit in terms of engineering and kind of working in a technical space. Yeah, I guess it's hard to. You've always got that sort of, I guess, that tension between this kind of technical evidence that you're trying to collect and this kind of empathy and trying to listen to people's stories as well, and to, I guess, acknowledge the trauma that they've been through. Yeah, a lot of people had that experience, and it was quite new to a lot of us. And I think certainly having that kind of shared experience with other people was really helpful. And those weekly meetings that we had, was part of it was aligning technical things and making sure that we're all on the same page, which again is part of that story of helping lighten that emotional load on people, but also to have that kind of shared experience and talking to each other. It was a really supportive environment.
Thank you, Tom. I think we're all really grateful for you sharing that experience, because it's hard to explain it sometimes when it's those emotive pieces. I think something that's really interesting for me, and especially early in my career, somebody who was really interested in going and doing humanitarian work in disaster relief and doing training in that space, was around understanding mandates, because you can't help everybody, but if you try and help everybody, then the people who really, really need it don't get it. And how do you get that balance right across the board? I think it's probably an interesting thing for us as engineers across the country to be reflecting on, whether we actually need to be thinking about helping our staff to understand what those circumstances would be for the future. It's a bit of a resilience question, really. But yeah, I can imagine being in that situation, especially when it's your hometown, feeling really, really tough to make those calls. In terms of reflection, so things are still going on. You guys are still doing some awesome work across Auckland. But reflecting now, is there anything that you do differently? Hindsight is a wonderful thing, but especially sharing it, sharing that hindsight. And if you were back in those circumstances, are there any things you do differently? Or maybe another way of looking at it is there anything you've put in place now from your learnings so that you're prepared for events occurring in the future, if anything, or when anything happens?
Something I reflect on a lot is that we knew the risk. We had all our models. Our models turned out to be really accurate. I suppose this is the case for a lot of places around New Zealand and the world where they haven't yet had these events, is to realise that this will happen, and it will happen again in Auckland. And so what can we do now, before the risk is realised, to reduce that risk? What we're doing as part of our ongoing work programs here, for example, Making Space for Water, is really investing in that awareness and education around flood risk. So just making sure that people know their risk, not just know theoretically, but thinking about how we express that in a way that they really understand what their risk is, and also what they can do about it to manage it, because you can't just tell someone their risk and then walk away. It needs to go hand in hand with what actions they can take to better manage that. So since the event, we've stood up the Auckland Flood Viewer that has both those things. You can type in your address, it tells you what risks are present there in terms of flooding, and then it links to a whole bunch of materials on what you can do. So I think that's something that everyone can and should be doing, is just really understanding and expressing that risk. And also preparing for the day when it happens to you. What are you going to do to understand the impact? What are you going to tell to your community? What are you going to put in place to support your communities after these events occur?
The wonderful lessons of preparedness and being ready in advance of an incident happening, And I think it's really important. I know I keep saying if, but really when. I think your point is exactly. Really when this is going to happen across, and it's increasingly happening. And in the last 2 weeks, we've seen things in the Tasman region, and currently, Auckland's got rain going on, hopefully not to any extent, but it's interesting to, we're seeing this increasingly. So it's the when is the really important point in all of this. Tom, from your perspective, was there anything else?
I think there's quite a lot of shared experience in different disasters between different professionals across the country, and it would be good to leverage a bit more of that, even to have some understanding or appreciation of what you're in for, I guess. The other side of the coin, I guess, is that I think just in general, when I look at the more proactive kind of projects that I'm working on now, and you're looking at mitigation strategies or anything like that, those stories to draw on, and you've got that, I guess it's sort of a ground truthing of what it actually means. And so I really think you don't want people to have to experience flooding to start appreciating that, or to be, have to talk to lots of people that have experienced flooding as well. So I think there's probably an education piece in helping people understand more about, the space in which we work and the reality of it, and try and, as well as that sort of the reality of that, it's also the understanding of the impact on the people. And even when you're working within a framework, you can't really predict how people are going to behave or react, or the circumstances that they're in, just, wrong place at the wrong time, that sort of thing. So I think all that sort of appreciation is can only help guide better decision making and better planning.
Thank you, Fiona and Tom, for joining Hannah and myself today. It's actually quite sobering hearing about the floods and all the work and effort you've gone through. So, well, thank you from the industry for what you've done, and also sharing your learnings today. We hope to have more stormwater and flood risk topics on the podcast in the future, so please get in touch if there's something you'd like us to cover. Thank you for listening to this latest episode. We'll be back soon with our next podcast.